Hi, my name is JRYussuf. I am the host of the YouTube channel Just JR, and I'm also the author of The Other F Word Forgiveness. Today, I am joined by a very special guest. His name is Jonathan Matthias Lassiter, PhD, and I'm going to read a little bit about him. Jonathan Matthias Lassiter, PhD, is a polymath who utilizes psychology, writing, and dance to help others heal and thrive. His roles include licensed clinical psychologist, professor, author, public speaker, and choreographer. As a public intellectual, Dr. Lassiter has been featured on television, radio, podcasts, and print, such as PBS and SiriusXM. He also co-hosts the YouTube channel Fly on the Wall, which centers healing, mental wellness, and loving Blackness. Dr. Lassiter is the award-winning co-editor of Black LGBT Health in the United States, The Intersection of Race, Gender, and Sexual Orientation. This book received the Gay and Lesbian Medical Association's Achievement Award. It is the first and only text to focus solely on Black LGBT Americans' holistic health. He is currently working on his first sole-authored book that will explore contemporary issues of race and mental health in the United States. Okay, so thank you so much for joining us today, Jonathan. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me.
Mhm. Cool. So we'll jump right ahead into the questions.
Okay.
So, the first question that I have for you is, why was it important for you to work on the Black LGBT health in the United States book?
Yes, thank you so much for that question. Why was it important? There was a need. There was a need. My co-editor, Dr. Lawrence Bollins, actually approached me about working on this book, and one of the things she said was that she just knew that this book already existed. Of course, it was 2015 at the time. Of course, someone had already written a book about Black LGBT health, but sure enough, they had not. The other thing that, as she and I were working on this book, that we found was that most of what had been written about Black LGBT people's health had been written by people that were not Black and who were not LGBT. And oftentimes it was written by white heterosexual women or white gay men. And so, in this way, Black LGBT people had not really had the chance to control our own narrative around our health. Another thing that we noticed was that most of it was focused on the negative. So, there was lots in the public health literature and psychological mental health literature about things that go wrong for Black LGBTQ folks. There was lots in the literature about HIV risk, about biomedical prevention such as PrEP or antiretroviral treatment. There was lots in the literature about mental health problems, but there was not a lot in the literature about the ways in which we as Black LGBTQ people thrive, how we support each other. There was not a lot about who we are in community with our families and our loved ones. And so Dr. Follis and I were like, we need to fix this. We want to create a more holistic picture of us, both our challenges and also how we transcend those challenges, how we thrive. And we wanted to do this from a FUBU perspective. We were both from a particular generation when FUBU had first came out, right? That for us, by us. And so you were
Right.
like, oh yeah, FUBU all day, every day. And so it was so important because we wanted to make an intervention into a space that allowed Black LGBTQ people to present their narratives, to own their narratives in a holistic manner. And again, that just had not happened. And so this is what came out of it: Black LGBT health in the United States, the intersection of race, gender, and sexual orientation. And so we're very proud of it. It won the Gay and Lesbian Medical Association's Achievement Award. So I encourage folks to check that out. And what another thing we were very intentional about was including different segments of the Black LGBTQ communities, because oftentimes people talk about us as a monolith, right? They talk about us as if we all have the same problems, but there's diversity within the community. We're a heterogeneous group, and we have specific needs. And so we wanted to be sure that we're talking about Black LGBTQ youth. We want to be sure that we're talking about Black bisexual women. We want to be sure that we're talking about Black same gender loving and bisexual men. We wanted to look across the gamut and pay special attention and focus in on the unique needs of each uh, sort of intersection of the community.
Right. Wow. And yeah, I hear in a lot of what you said, I hear, being marginalized on many different axes. It's not just that you're Black, it's not just that you are LGBT. But for example, there are Black lesbians, there are Black trans women who are lesbians. So it sounds like that work that you all did was very, very, very important.
We hope so. We hope that it changes lives. Another thing that Dr. Collins and I were very intentional about was ensuring that we wrote the book and edited the book in a way that it would be accessible to people who are not academics. So often we academics create things that only 5 other academics read, right? And we were like, no, we want this to be something that has merit for the healthcare providers and the researchers working with this population, but also for the people themselves who are part of the population, because both Dr. Fowles and I are part of the Black LGBTQ community. So we're part of those communities. And so we wanted our text to be something that could be picked up by everyday people who are in those communities, and they'll see themselves on those pages.
It's awesome. So why was it important for you to go into therapy, being a therapist?
Yes. I love this question because it always takes me back to my childhood. I always say that I became a clinical psychologist because I really did not understand my family growing up, and I did not understand myself as an adolescent. And so I love my family. They are great. Like many Black families, they did the best they could with limited resources, with limited exposure. And so I, in no way, want to disparage my family or put them down, because I recognize them as human beings. And I think that's part of my own personal healing. Because as growing up, I thought my parents were like demigods. It was like God and my parents, right? And so, and so so when they did things that didn't make sense, I was like, well, why are you doing these things that don't make sense? You're like a demigod. Like, what's going on, right? And so and so for me, coming to mental health and studying psychology, the study of the mind, was like me trying to figure out, okay, so if you do A plus B, you'll get C. You did A plus B and you got C, but now you're mad. Why? So I really wanted to figure that out. And so that got me very much interested in psychology and mental health. Um, Another thing was my own journey with my mental health. I was very depressed and suicidal as an adolescent, particularly around my Christianity. I was raised Christian in the South, Augusta, Georgia, very Southern Black household, raised Christian. And as my sexuality became something that I could no longer deny, it was always there, but it was something that I sort of like pushed in the background. But as I got older, it was something that became harder and harder to push into the background. And so I needed to find there was a conflict. There was a conflict between my Christianity and my sexual orientation. And so I became very depressed, I became very suicidal. And it was not until I went off to college that I started to do some of that work to heal around that. And so again, that pushed me into psychology and mental health even more. And so when I went off to graduate school, I said, I really want to understand how religion and spirituality influences Black LGBTQ people's health at that time, particularly Black gay, bisexual, and same gender loving men, because there was a lot of focus on HIV in the community among Black gay, bisexual, and same gender loving men. But something that occurred to me was like, why would anyone use a condom if they believe that God doesn't love them? But no one was really asking that question at that time. And so it really made me dive deep into that. So the sort of short answer, even though I just gave you the long answer, but this is sort of sum up. What really caused me to dig deep into mental health was, one, trying to understand my family, and two, trying to find some sort of healing for myself. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
So many people who have never been to therapy are afraid to go because they do not know what to expect, among other things. Can you walk me through what a consultation or a first meeting with you would be like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So again, it's going to look different for each therapist, but for me, a consultation is usually a phone call. Someone reaches out to me. I'm easily accessible via the internet, right? You could look me up and find my contact information if you're interested in services. But someone usually reaches out to me, and I usually call them, and I say, "Hi, I noticed that you had a request for psychotherapy." And so I'm usually trying to figure out what is it that they perceive to be their issue, if you will, right? What do they want to work on?
Mhm.
And I do an assessment for myself, like, and do I believe that I, as a therapist, have the sort of skill to provide the healing that this person needs to deal with this issue, right? And that's part of being an ethical therapist. Is I'm not just going to take on any and all clients, right? Just because, oh, I want this client. No, it's about, do I feel that I uniquely have something to offer that will contribute to this person's healing. And so, with that said, I'm making that sort of assessment. And then I go into telling the client about how I work. What I always tell my clients in that initial, or potential clients at that point in that initial session, that consultation, is that therapy is a relationship. And so it's two people are together working towards the healing of the client. And so there are going to be things I'm bringing, but there are things that the client needs to bring. I always say, you're the expert on your life. I may have been in school and been practicing for years. However, I am not the expert on you. My job is to get to know you, to understand you, to see the ways in which there may be um, oversights for you, things that you're overlooking in your life, and to help bring those out and put those on the table. And then, I have to tell clients that I very much pay attention to culture in the client's life, and also spirituality in this broad sense of it being a animating essence that enlivens us all, right? It is very much, again, about the relationship. So I let clients know that, or potential clients, as I said at that point, know that in that consultation, and then we make a decision about whether or not they believe that's something that will be conducive for them in their healing. In that first session, I'm just getting to know them. I really view myself as one human being in a relationship with another human being. It's not about me as an expert or my, doctor. I often say that, like, really the only people that call me doctor are my students, right? My clients don't really call me doctor. Some of them do, because they enjoy that, right? I personally call my own therapist doctor, right? But a lot of times I have clients who call me Jonathan, and I'm perfectly fine with that, because we're two human beings in a relationship. The focus is on the client, but my job in that very first session is to get to know them. Where are they coming from? What do they want to work on? And then to chart a path forward together.
Let me just say how commendable that is. That is so cool because as a person who has been in therapy for a very long time, since like 2012, that's not always like the attitude that therapists come into therapy with. And I'm not really sure why that is. But sometimes therapists can come across as though their method, their techniques, or are like the end all be all, or as though they are the expert in the room. You know what I mean? So I really appreciate like that humility, and also like you said, just that person to person. Like we're people, we're human beings, we're both human beings. You know, I think that is very reassuring is maybe one of the words I'm looking for. Yeah, that'll be fine for now. Reassuring. So my next question is, so I noticed that time in lockdown has made a lot of people do a lot of reflecting, and I've even had a few guys reach out to me via email or on YouTube because they just realized that they're bisexual and they know that a lot of what I do on my channel surrounds like bisexuality and Black men. And some of them they knew before, but they just realized that it's something that's important for them to deeply understand or name for themselves. So I just wonder, can you speak to some of the ways this past year has forced some of us to take a deeper look at ourselves?
Yes. This year has definitely made it possible for a lot of us to go deeper. Some of us still avoid, but some of us have, because we don't have the same distractions in the same way that we've had before. Like before, we could like go to a park, or I mean, still go to a park now, as long as you're socially distanced. But we can hang out with friends, we go to a restaurant, so on and so forth. There were so many things we could do to distract ourselves, and with those limited options over the past year, people have really had to sit with their emotions, and if not sit with them, they've been harder to ignore. And so people have really began to question themselves in ways that they haven't questioned themselves before. And one of the things that I always encourage people as we do this sort of reflection is to have grace with yourself, and to approach this reflection with acceptance and with a welcoming, and try to leave aside the self-criticism, because as things come to light, there can be a tendency, especially in the ways in which we are all raised in this world to sort of be perfect in a certain sense, right, to criticize ourselves. But the reflection can be a place of welcoming, it could be a place of self-compassion. And I also say that with the reflection, it's often helpful, it can be helpful to put that reflection in conversation with someone who you feel safe with, so a trusted other, because sometimes we can go too deep into our head, but it can be good to put that on the table in front of someone else and wade through some of that stuff with someone else that you trust, whether that is a therapist or a family member or a romantic partner or whoever, and you feel safe with. Some people it may not be safe to share those reflections with, but with some people it may be. And so I encourage that as well. But yeah, this year has really been challenging for a lot of us, but it's also provided an opportunity to do some of the deep work that a lot of us have been avoiding and been easily distracted from before.
Hmm. Can you talk about some alternatives to talk therapy or therapy in general that support emotional intelligence and recognizing things like trauma or um, emotional processing, really?
Yeah. So a lot of my work is informed by an Afrocentric psychological perspective, and what that is it understands that the key to mental wellness lies in those sort of pre-colonial values of different African societies. And a lot of those values, or say some of those core values, are community, interconnectivity, meaning if something happens to me, it affects you. If something happens to you, it affects me. And spirituality, the sense of, again, in the broad sense, of being connected to something greater than ourselves, to being connected to the earth and to animals and to our ancestors and to the yet unborn, the people that will come after us, to being connected to the sacred and divine. And so all of those things do not require a licensed psychotherapist. A licensed psychotherapist can be helpful in tapping into those things, to examine those things, but those are things that we can do for ourselves. So for example, if we're thinking about community, a pathway to mental wellness is through community. Again, your community should be people that you trust, people that you feel safe with, right? You don't want to build a community with people that are toxic. But if you have people in your community that are safe, that you trust, then you can find mental wellness by sharing your emotions with them. You can find mental wellness by helping them do something. Sometimes giving to others can be a way to get out of our own distressed thoughts, right? We can find community by, again, that interconnectivity. How are we connecting with others? How are we pouring into others? How are we allowing others to pour into us? We can also find that mental wellness, again, through spirituality. How are we tapping into the sacred, into the divine in ourselves? How are we treating ourselves as divine? Sometimes we don't treat ourselves as sacred. Sometimes we don't get enough rest. We don't eat the most nutritious foods, right? It's one thing to treat ourselves every now and then with some Oreos, but are we only putting Oreos in our body, right? Sometimes we treat ourselves in ways that are not conducive with the ways in which the sacred would treat us. It's not treating ourselves as sacred. So all of these are different pathways to mental wellness that don't require a psychotherapist. And so there are many others, but those are just a few that immediately come to mind.
Okay. And are there any tips that you would give Black people who are experiencing feelings of hopelessness, despair, grief, or anger right now?
Yes. The first thing I would say is you are not alone. You are not alone. If you're experiencing anger, grief, despair, hopelessness right now, you are not alone. These things are common, especially in a world that does not value Black people, in a world that does not value Black lives and Black mental health, the sacredness of Blackness. All those feelings make sense. Who wouldn't feel that way if you are constantly being attacked personally and as a community? And we are, as Black people. We are, as Black people. But however, as Black people, we know how to transcend those attacks, that constant oppression. And so first off, I would say that you are not alone. Second, I would say, to as much as it is safe, we don't want to go down a rabbit hole and feel like we can't pull ourselves out, or feel as if we're on the verge of harming ourselves. We don't want to go down that road. But if we are feeling, anger or sadness, then lean into those things. Question yourself, what messages are these emotions trying to give me? What lessons might I learn from this? Where do I feel it in my body? So allow yourself to welcome those emotions and not run away from them. Oftentimes, again, we're all raised in a way that emotional suppression or denying our emotions is the default. So in these moments, I would say to really lean into those emotions. Allow yourself to lean in those emotions, because those emotions are part of you. And if you deny those emotions, you're denying yourself. And when we deny ourselves and the fullness of who we are, we're doing the same thing that those systems of oppression and other people do to us as Black people. And so the same way we want other people to allow us space to make our lives matter, we can do that for ourselves and allowing ourselves to be with those emotions. And the last thing I would say is to reach out. Reach out. If you are feeling that way, reach out again to trusted, safe others in your life, whether that again is a family member, a peer, or a trained mental health professional.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we're going to shift into questions from my YouTube audience now. So the first question comes from the user Bree, and they asked, what are the best ways to find a Black therapist in your community and online?
So on the internet has made it easier now than in any other time in history to find a Black therapist. However, as therapists, we are licensed by state, and so it may be harder in some states than others to find a therapist, a Black therapist in particular. But there are places like the National Queer and Trans Therapists of Color Network. There's therapy for Black men, therapy for Black women, therapy for Black children, melanated, melanin and mental health. There are lots of different places online where you can go to find directories of Black therapists. Again, as I said, depending on what state you're in, it may be more difficult than others. But maybe you don't necessarily need a therapist. Maybe a mental wellness coach could be appropriate depending on your level of need. And so, mental wellness coach, those sort of barriers to access and licensing are a little bit different. And so those folks may be able to practice across state lines compared to folks who are licensed mental health professionals who can only practice within their state in which they're licensed. So I would say using some of those avenues and ask around. You know, if you know someone who knows a therapist, then ask around. Also, if you have a university or college in the area you live, there may be Black trainees who are there that could also provide services for you, or Black therapists on staff there that could provide services for you. So I would say that those are some avenues.
Thank you. So the next question comes from the user Ava Ness, and their question reads, are there some traits, qualities, or questions you'd recommend in a non-Black therapist if people do not have access to a Black therapist?
Yes, I do. So ask one, regardless of the color of your therapist, always ask questions of them. I often encourage my clients to ask questions of me. We often process our relationship together because, again, it's a relationship and it needs to be working for the client. And really for me, again, I'm in this too, right? But really the goal should be towards the healing of the client. So ask questions of your therapist. So if you have a non-Black therapist, you know, I say ask them, how do they think about anti-racism? Who are they reading? What Black therapist, what Black scholar, what Black researcher, what Black artist is influencing their work, right? And make them go beyond the sort of stock answers, because sometimes you hear it over and over again. Well, you know, I read you know, how to be an anti-racist. Okay, but that's sort of low-hanging fruit, right? what what have you really, and that just came out, right? So what are you really doing, right? Like, what have you been doing, right? So you know, some people say, well, I read Toni Morrison. Okay, but who have you read beyond that, right? So you know, what are the Black thinkers, scholars, healers, artists that influence your work and how you think about Black people? Because that's going to say a lot, right? The other thing I would say is, how do you think about your role as an advocate for Black people? So not just as a therapist, but again, from an Afrocentric psychological perspective, it's not enough to be a therapist that works with Black people, but we should also be advocates working on behalf of Black people in our communities. So ask those questions of that non-Black therapist. What work are you doing outside of this therapy session on behalf of Black communities? How has that been sustained across your life, right? What goals do you have to sustain that work, to continue that work? So I would say ask those questions, and also ask, how are you reckoning with these things for yourself, right? How do you reckon with your own anti-Blackness? Because we're all raised and socialized in a world that teaches us anti-Blackness, including Black therapists. You know, we're raised in that same world as well. But how are you reckoning with that for yourself? So those are some questions that can be asked of a non-Black therapist. But what I will say is that no therapist, Black or otherwise, should be coming to you as the client asking you to do that work for them. we should, as a client, I would encourage you to never allow your therapist to take up space in the therapy room to work out their own racial equity work. They should be doing that outside of the room and be able to process how race shows up and racism shows up for you in the room, not not their process.
Right. It's my session, not your session. um, so the next question comes from user Ross Victory, and they ask, what is the best way to heal internalized racial trauma?
Yeah. First thing is recognizing it. A lot, as I said, we are all socialized, raised in a world that's anti-Black. I teach multicultural psychology as well as African American psychology, and one of the things that I always bring up with my students is that racism and a lot of different other isms, sexism, transphobia, class oppression, all these things. It's like we're fish, and those things are the water. And the same way that a fish does not necessarily know it's in the water, it's just alive, right? As human beings, we're within these systems. We're all influenced by these systems, and we may not even know that we are. So that first step is recognizing it. That second step is giving ourselves grace for the ways in which we perpetuate anti-Blackness. However, holding ourselves responsible to do something different. So grace in the sense that, oh my God, I can't believe I've been doing this the entire time. Yeah, but as everyone else, you have been trained to be anti-Black in big and small ways.
Yeah.
However, now that you know, how are you going to hold yourself accountable?
Yeah.
What work are you going to do? What books are you going to pick up? What materials are you going to engage? How are you going to embrace your own Black culture? How are you going to learn more about your own Black culture? I was talking to a colleague yesterday, and she was saying how she's been reading Caste by I believe that's Isabel Wilkerson, and about trying to do a lot of education around the sort of anti-Blackness or racism in America. And I encouraged her to also look at the Black genius in America and the Black cultural gifts, or as W.E.B. Du Bois would say, the gifts of Black folks. So not only thinking about the cultural trauma that we've experienced as Black people, but what are the artists, what are the Black artists saying? Where's the beauty in being Black? Where's the beauty that's there? Because there's a lot of it. And so part of addressing some of that internalized anti-Blackness is looking at the genius, the beauty, the sacredness of Blackness, and not only the trauma and the brutality that we experience.
Beautifully said. The next question comes from user JAB197100. And their question is, what are some ways to make sure your future children don't experience trauma in their childhood like you may have? And how can you address trauma if or when it does occur in children?
Yes. So again, I will start with one, recognizing when we are enacting traumatic experiences, but also recognizing our own trauma. As I said before, as Black people, we have often been raised in families by parents who were raised by parents who did not have a language of mental health or mental wellness. The focus was on survival because there was real constant threat of bodily harm and of death. And so to love one's child at a particular point for Black people was an emotional risk. It was an emotional risk because there were ways in which Black people had no rights to their own children or could not protect their children from white brutality. And we see it the same in some ways today. It has not changed. I think about Tamir Rice, right? Where they could not protect his father could not protect him, right? And so in that way, it could be a risk. White supremacy, hetero sexism has made it a risk to protect our Black children, our Black, our LGBTQ children. And so to understand that history, to understand that trauma, to understand the trauma that we have experienced. Also, forgiveness of the trauma that we may have experienced. Again, whether that's what I call the big T trauma, bodily harm, threats of death, witnessing that in others, or that small T trauma, the emotional abuse, the emotional manipulation. So forgiving the people that did that to us, because as long as we don't forgive, we hold that inside. And if we hold that inside, we're going to replicate that in our relationships. Our primary caregivers, our mothers, our fathers, our grandmothers, our cousins, those people who are responsible for us as children, they serve as the model for all of our relationships going forward. And so if we are holding unforgiveness for them, then we're going to visit that same thing on in all our other relationships that come after. And so forgiving them, forgiving ourselves. Sometimes we blame ourselves for the sort of traumas that we experience as children. Oh my God, it must be something I did. Oh my gosh, I should have known better. Forgiving ourselves. And so the more that we work towards our own healing of our own trauma, then the more that we can accept, we can forgive, and the less likely we will visit that onto our children. And if we notice that our children are being traumatized, whether by other family members or their peers, then providing the space for children to talk about that, and also providing a space and seeking out resources for that child to heal. And so again, that trauma may be big, it may be small, it may be cultural, maybe it's in the school system. Oftentimes I talk about how Black children, we're traumatized in the school system when we aren't presented in the curriculum. We're only presented as, as slaves or during the civil rights era. But our contributions as a people are not talked about in the curriculum. And so that's a form of trauma. So how do we provide opportunities for our children to see themselves as, again, geniuses, as inventors, as scientists, as artists, things like that? And again, how do we help our children practice self-love and forgiveness and grace for themselves? So those are all ways that we can start to deal with the trauma that we've experienced and not visiting on our children, and also provide space for our children to experience healing from trauma.
A couple of weeks ago, I did this this seminar and training and learning stuff, and it was with the Beam Network, and it was kind of founded after Joseph Beam, which was like this Black gay healer essentially, and through that training, I learned about like how even though maybe Black people haven't always used medical terms for mental wellness, we've always participated in healing, and we've always participated in like you were talking about earlier, like community and care. And so I think it's also important to recognize yeah, some of the ways that maybe some of our families have been in a position where they had to act as like for survival, out of survival, but also the family members and people in our communities who have also provided care and who have tried to foster healing too throughout generations, so that is also a part of like the legacy of Blackness. So the next question I have is from user Hannah Vosart vlog. And their question is, how should a biracial person protect their peace and mental health and heal from racism while doing anti-racist work from a place of some white passing privilege?
Yes. So again, I go back to that Afrocentric psychological perspective, and logic from that perspective is a both and logic. It's not an either or. And oftentimes in the Western sense, we think about either this or that. And The Afrocentric psychological perspective says both and. So there is work to be done on both sides. So one, acknowledging the harm that you've experienced due to racism and anti-Blackness, and allowing yourself to reach out to get the help that you need to heal from that. And at the same time, understanding the privilege that you have and using that privilege. Sometimes people with privilege, whether that's racial privilege, whether that's cisgender privilege, whether that is heterosexual privilege, whether that's male privilege, how do we use that privilege and not just get stuck in, oh my God, I have privilege and I feel guilty and so on and so forth, but how do we use that to advocate on behalf of others, especially when they're not in the room? Right? How do we use that privilege to advocate on behalf of others? And so there's work to be done on both sides. And so I would encourage this viewer to, again, seek out space to heal from the hurt and the harm that you've experienced, and also seek out ways to use your privilege in very real, concrete ways to advocate on the behalf of others.
Okay, and then this brings us to our last question, and this is by the user Ava Ness again. And their question reads, have any of your clients come to you because they had an idea of what a Black therapist would be like in terms of culture or being, in terms of Blackness, then experience the reality of that, and that causes some tension, disconnection, or conflict?
Yeah, so thank you for this question. I would just have to say that I don't know. So a lot of research shows that therapy clients usually come to therapy, and oftentimes if they discontinue after the first session or their second session. And so if that's true, right, then I don't know if my client, I don't know what the reason that was. Usually there's no like exit interview if the client's not telling me, oh, this is why I'm not coming back. They just don't come back, right? So I don't know if that's true, but or what the reason is for them not coming back. So I don't have any definitive. I don't have a definitive answer for you. What I will say though is that I do have a lot of clients who do come to me because I am Black, because I am a Black man, because I'm a Black same-gender loving man, and they want to work through those issues. They come to me because I, again, deal with spirituality and culture in the session. And I approach things from this Afrocentric psychological perspective that really focuses on what is it like to be a whole person, taking this holistic perspective. So if folks have a problem with that, is not what they expected. Again, I don't know if that's the reason they don't come back, but it can be a lot of different reasons. But I'm sure that maybe that is the reason that some folks don't come back.
Right.
Yeah.
What do you do?
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for having this conversation. It is much needed, and I feel really enlivened hearing a lot of what you had to say today. If you want to keep up with Jonathan, you can keep up with him on his YouTube channel called Fly on the Wall, where he discusses mental wellness, growth, healing, and Blackness. Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
Okay.